Welcome to developmental psychology. It's also sometimes called human development, sometimes called lifespan development. All these terms can be used interchangeably. Um, so why are you here? Why are you taking this class? Well, perhaps you are a parent, or one day you will be a parent or a teacher. Um, if so, your responsibility is going to be about children. And children are going to be a part of your everyday life. The more you learn about them, the better you can raise them or teach them. Perhaps you hope to gain some insight about your own personal history as an infant, as a child, as a teenager, or even as a young adult. Perhaps you want to know more about what your life will be like as you grow through your adult years, through your middle-aged years, through old age. I know that this course is required for most nursing majors and most likely psychology majors, but even if you are taking this class for other reasons, or you had to take this class because it was a requirement, you will learn a lot about people in general and those around you and yourself. You'll learn a lot about basically the development of a person from birth to death. So basically what we're going to cover in this course is an individual's life from birth to death, and these go through periods of development. And the first period starts it's known as the prenatal period, and that's basically from conception. So the period of development starts at that very first level of conception. It doesn't even start at birth, so it starts 9 months before that. And that period ranges from conception to birth, and it's approximately 9 months. That can range for different people. I know that my mom actually was pregnant with me for, I think, about 9 months and 2 weeks, so she was 2 weeks late. So that does range. Sometimes you'll have women who give birth earlier than 9 months. Then we have the infancy period of development, and that's from birth to approximately 18 to 24 months. And the chapters associated with these periods of development might be a little bit different in your book, depending on which book you do have. But the general idea is still going to be the same. So, early childhood ranges from 2 years old to about 5 to 6 years, and these are considered the play years for children. Then we have middle and late childhood, and that's approximately 6 to 11 years old. Then we have adolescence, and that's from about 10 to 12 to all the way to 18 to 21 years old. And these are, the teenage years. Most of you have already been through these years. Some of you might be towards the end of these years in your own personal lives. Then we have early adulthood, and that's the early 20s through the 30s. Middle adulthood is 40 to 60 years old, and late adulthood is 60 to 70 years old all the way till death. So most of the time, we see qualities in an individual that make that person unique. But as humans, we have all traveled some common paths. Each of us, you, me, Leonardo da Vinci, George Washington, Martin Luther King, we've all walked, at about 1 year old. We've all engaged in fantasy play as a young child, and we became more independent as children. Each of us, if we live long enough, we'll experience things like hearing problems, our bodies will start to decline, maybe vision problems, we'll have to wear reading glasses and things like that. Eventually, we'll experience death of family members and friends, unfortunately, but it's all part of life. And basically, this is the general course of our development. So what's development? And the definition that your book talks about is that development is the pattern of movement or change that begins at conception and continues through the human lifespan. And one of the traditional approaches to development emphasizes that there's extensive change from birth to adolescence with little or no change in adulthood and also decline in old age. The lifespan approach emphasizes that developmental change occurs throughout childhood and adulthood. So the difference here between the two approaches is that in the traditional approach, there's very little change after adolescence. And it's basically a steep decline in old age. And in the lifespan approach, basically, that emphasizes the difference there is that there is change throughout childhood and adulthood. So even after adolescence, we're still going to be changing. We're still going to be learning a lot of new things. And I do find that most people tend to agree more with the lifespan approach in the sense that people do change a lot into adulthood and even after adulthood, even into old age. Some of the characteristics of the lifespan perspective. Basically, the chart here shows that the oldest person recorded was 122 years old. That's pretty old. But that's not the average, meaning obviously most of us are not going to live to be 122 years old unless they make some really advanced changes in the medical community and things like that. But basically, the average lifespan is 78 years old. And just to show you how we kind of look how humans look against other species, we can see that humans tend to live one of the longest maximum lifespans than other species. The Galapagos turtles, they tend to live over 100 years old. So as for humans, generally we don't live to be that old. As you can see, the average life expectancy is 78 years old. That's actually from 2005. As of right now, I think the age is a tad bit above 78. It might be 78.5, somewhere around there, but still in that general range. But as you can see, in ancient Greece and prehistoric times, the average life expectancy was a lot younger, 18 and 21 and 20 years old. So for a lot of us, if we were living back in the ancient Greece and prehistoric times, most of us would be probably dead right now. So we can all feel lucky that we're not living in that time. So yes, as we continue through the ages, we've advanced in a lot of ways, and that's all a contribution as to why our life expectancy has gotten a lot older than it was. So the lifespan perspective views development as lifelong, meaning no age period is dominant, like we spoke about before. That's the lifespan perspective. We continue to develop throughout adulthood, basically. And the lifespan views development as multidimensional, and that means your mind, emotions, and relationships are changing and constantly affecting each other. The lifespan perspective also views development as multidirectional, meaning dimensions expand and shrink. So our capacity to learn, for example, a new language dramatically decreases after early childhood. So they say the best time to learn a new language is somewhere in the early childhood years, maybe between 3 and somewhere between 5 and 6 years old. That would be the best time to learn a new language, because after that, that dimension, that capacity to learn a new language in our brains, that dramatically decreases, and it'll be harder for us to learn a new language after that age period. So the lifespan perspective also views development as plastic, meaning it's we're capable of change. One example is, can you teach an old dog new tricks? Well, basically, training and strategies allows us to learn new tricks, new things in our 70s and 80s. But please do keep in mind that plasticity and capacity for change is dramatically decreased at around those ages. So our plasticity when we're young is very high. We are definitely capable of change very easily, but as we get older into our 70s and 80s, that capacity does shrink. But it's still there. So the lifespan perspective also views development as contextual, meaning it occurs within a setting. And there's 3 types of contextual influences. There's the normative age-graded influences, and that's similar for individuals of a particular age group. So these are the normative age-graded influences usually happen to individuals once they reach a particular age. So I think it's 18 years old, you can go out and vote. You can get your driver's license. You can get your restricted permit, I think, at 15 years old, and you can get your driver's license at 16 years old. So that's going to be a normative age-graded influence, because it's going to be the same for everyone of a particular age. Voting would be 18, driver's license 15 and 16. And then also retirement, that's going to be you're allowed to retire at a particular age. So that's a normative age-graded influence. Then you have normative history-graded influences. And that's common to people of a particular generation because of historical circumstances. So a lot of us we know about 9/11, but people, for example, that were born, let's say, in the 1900s might not necessarily, they're not going to know 9/11 unless they've lived to be over 100. So that's basically a normative history graded influence. It's common to people of a particular generation. So the Great Depression. You and me, we haven't experienced the Great Depression. We've read about it in history books, but it's not something that we've actually gone through. So that's considered a normative history graded influence. Then we have non-normative life events. And these are unusual occurrences that have a major impact on the individual's life. So one example of that would be winning the lottery. I mean, I wouldn't mind winning the lottery. I'm sure most of us wouldn't mind winning the lottery, but most of us don't win the lottery. So that's considered a non-normative life event. It's not normal to have for that event to happen to every individual. So as we go through the book and we go through the different chapters and periods of development in life, we're going to talk about the types of developmental changes that an individual will go through, and that includes biological changes, cognitive changes, and socio-emotional changes. that happened during the different periods of life. So biological changes, that's basically, what is that? That's basically changes that happen to an individual's physical nature. So things that are happening to our bodies physically, how we grow during different periods of our life. We'll get taller. Our bodies change. Then the cognitive change, that's basically changes in thought, intelligence, and also language. So when we're babies, we don't really know much about language. We don't speak. We'll say goo goo and gaga. But as we get older, we develop vocabulary. We can put sentences together, and we can, speak. And that's changes in our cognitive language, changes in thoughts and intelligence. Then we have socio-emotional changes, and that's basically the changes in relationships, our relationships with other people. Changes in our emotions. Sometimes we'll feel happy, sometimes we'll feel sad. Changes in our personality. Maybe when we were a child, we didn't have the same personality as we will when we're in our old age, in our adulthood. We're not going to feel the same way about things, and those all have to do with socio-emotional aspects of ourselves. We're not going to have the same friends we did when we were 2 years old. I mean, maybe some of you will, but it's very rare that happens, because we're going through these types of changes. As far as happiness and age, it's kind of consistent throughout our lives. They did this research study where they kind of measured happiness in people across the lifespan, and what they found was that it's pretty consistent. Happiness tends to be pretty high between the ages of 15 years old and 24 years old. It gets a little bit lower around 25 to 34, a little bit lower around 35 to 44 years old, and then it looks like the lowest time for happiness is around 45 to 64 years old. And then after that, after 65 years old, that's one of the more happier times. So some people do say that, around 45 to 64 years old, a lot of people are going through something called a midlife crisis, and maybe that can be a contributing factor as to why their happiness is lower around that time. But that's all speculation, so we don't really know for sure. According to some lifespan experts, chronological age is not a very relevant way to understanding a person's psychological development. So what's chronological age? Chronological age is basically the way that people usually determine how old an individual is, how old a person is. It's basically our age from how many years have elapsed from since birth, basically. So a baby might be 3 months old. That's considered a person's chronological age. But in human development, we think about age in a lot of different ways. We do consider chronological age, but there's also other types of age. There's the biological age, and that's basically how old our bodies are. There's also the psychological age, and that's an individual's adaptive capacity compared with those of other individuals of the same chronological age. So older adults who are more flexible, who have more positive personality traits, who can control their emotions, think clearly, engage in more adaptive behaviors. they can be considered to have a younger psychological age than those other types of adults who have a lower type of kind of a plasticity, as we mentioned before. They have less capacity for change. Those types of people can be considered to have an older psychological age. Then we have our social age. And that basically refers to the social roles and expectations related to a person's age. So consider the role of a mother and the behaviors that accompany that role. In predicting an adult woman's behavior, it may be more important to know that she is the mother of a 3-year-old than to know whether she's 20 or 30 years old. So that can be considered a social role, social age. So there's 5 different theoretical orientations to development that we talk about in this class, and those include the psychoanalytic theory, the cognitive theory, behavioral and social cognitive theories, the ethological, and the ecological theories. And for this class, we're not gonna focus too much on the psychoanalytic. We'll briefly go over that. We're not gonna focus too much on a few of these theoretical orientations. We are gonna briefly go over them though. So the first theory we're going to talk about is psychoanalysis, and that was developed by an individual named Sigmund Freud. He's very famous in the field of psychology. Some of you might have heard of him. So basically, he coined the term psychoanalysis. And psychoanalytic theories basically describe development as a primarily unconscious and heavily colored by emotion. So development is described as unconscious, and what that means is beyond our awareness, beyond what we know. So Freud's theory. As Freud listened to, probed, and analyzed his patients, he became convinced that their problems were the result of experiences in early life. He thought that as children grow, their focus of pleasure and sexual impulses shifts from the mouth to the anus and eventually to the genitals. And he's kind of thought of in a negative light for his focus on sexual impulses and sexual changes throughout development. As a result, he kind of came up with these 5 stages that he said that individuals go through, and he called them these psychosexual developmental stages. And that ranges from the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency, and the genital stage. Freud claimed that our adult personality is determined by the way we resolve conflicts between sources of pleasure at each stage and the demands for reality at each of these stages. His theory has been revised numerous times by different theorists today. Many of them did claim that he overemphasized these sexual instincts. And most of the theorists place more emphasis on cultural experiences as a determinant of an individual's development, though unconscious thought does remain a central theme. So that thought plays a greater role than Freud did originally envision, according to other theorists. So another theorist that is very famous in the field of developmental psychology is Erik Erikson. And Erik Erikson was born in 1902 in Germany. He had a Jewish mother and a Danish father. And he was born in Germany, and when he was in grammar school, he was kind of teased by his peers, the other students, for being he was teased for being Jewish, and he didn't feel comfortable being German. He didn't feel comfortable being Jewish, and that's kind of where his whole theory started, where he came up with the basis for his theory. And one of the basic elements of his theory is the theory that individuals go through something called an identity crisis, and that happens usually at around the adolescent years. So he came up with these different stages, and one of them is the identity crisis. And basically, he has 8 stages of development that a person goes through. An individual is faced with a developmental task and a crisis, and that must be solved at each stage of life. But when you think of crisis, don't think of catastrophe. Don't think of the end of the world. This is just something that an individual faces when they go through the stage. And the more successful an individual resolves the crisis, the healthier that the development will be in future stages. It'll be easier for an individual to go on to the next stage if they face the previous stage. So basically, Erikson's theory explains psychosocial development in 8 stages, and these are what the 8 stages look like. You have, in the first stage, trust versus mistrust, all the way till death, till old age, and that's ego integrity versus despair. And we're gonna go through those in more detail. So from birth to 1 year old, this is going to be the first stage of development, according to Erik Erikson, and that's trust versus mistrust. At this stage, infancy, the first stage, trust in infancy, sets the stage for lifelong expectation that the world will be a good and pleasant place. So it's at this stage that children are basically, they're babies, they're just born, and they have their mother or their father or whoever to tend to them when they want their needs met. So, for example, they're hungry. They're going to cry when they're hungry. And when they cry, usually the mother or the father, or whoever it is going to come and feed them. And that's how they start to develop that sense of trust. When they get the food, when they're hungry, they begin to trust their environment. They begin to trust their mother, their father, whoever, those around them. But if they don't get that food or attention that they need when they need it, then they'll start to develop a sense of mistrust. And that's what happens during the first stage. The second stage is autonomy versus shame. And that's 1 year old to 3 years old. And that's where children learn to express their will and independence, to exercise some control and to make choices. If not, they'll experience shame and doubt. At the third stage, this is the stage known as initiative versus guilt. And that's ranges from 3 years old to 6 years old. This is where children begin to initiate activities. They begin to plan and undertake tasks and enjoy developing motor and other abilities. So, for example, they start doing things like rollerblading, engaging in playful activities. If they're not allowed to initiate these types of activities, or if they're made to feel stupid and considered a nuisance, they may develop a sense of guilt. Then at the fourth stage, that's industry versus inferiority, and that's 6 years old till puberty. This is where children develop industriousness. They feel pride in accomplishing things, making things, doing things. And if they're not encouraged to do this, by their parents or their teachers, they may develop a sense of inferiority or feeling like they're not as good as other people. Then at stage 5, that's identity versus role confusion. And that's kind of the basis of where Erik Erikson came up with his theory. And this happens in adolescence. Adolescents must make the transition from childhood to adulthood. So this is kind of like the middle ground of where that occurs. So this is where individuals are establishing an identity. They're developing a sense of self, and consider a future occupational identity, basically finding out who they are. Otherwise, if they don't get to do that, they'll develop role confusion. Then at the 6th stage, which is intimacy versus isolation, this is young adulthood. Young adults must develop intimacy, or the ability to share with, care for, and commit themselves to another person. If they don't do that, if they avoid that intimacy, that'll bring about a sense of isolation or loneliness. At the 7th stage, that's generativity versus stagnation, middle-aged people must find some way of contributing to the development of the next generation. A lot of times, people at this age will have children. Not at all times, but some people do. And according to Erikson, for those that don't get to contribute to the development of the next generation, they may become self-absorbed. And emotionally impoverished. They may reach a point of stagnation in their lives. So then at the last stage, this is stage 8, known as integrity versus despair. This is the late adulthood. Individuals in this stage are basically reviewing their lives. And if they're satisfied and feel a sense of accomplishment, they will experience ego integrity. But if they're not satisfied, they may sink into despair. So that was that's basically Erik Erikson's stages of development. And his theory is considered a psychoanalytic theory. Basically, psychoanalytic theories include an emphasis on developmental framework, family relationships, and unconscious aspects of the mind. There are criticisms to the psychoanalytic theories, and some of the criticisms include that people say that there's a lack of scientific support for the psychoanalytic theories. There's also too much emphasis on sexual underpinnings, and there's an image of people that's too negative, according to the criticisms. So psychoanalytic theories stress the importance of the unconscious, whereas cognitive theories, such as Piaget's theory, kind of emphasize the idea of conscious thoughts. And 3 important cognitive theories are Piaget's cognitive theory, Vygotsky's social-cultural cognitive theory, and the information processing theory. So Piaget's cognitive theory basically states that children go through 4 stages of development as they actively construct their understanding of the world. Basically, it emphasizes the processes of organization and adaptation. And within Piaget's theory, he stresses that there's 4 stages of cognitive development. And he basically says that these stages occur in children, and that there's very little or no change after that. So these are the 4 stages: the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, the concrete operations stage, and the formal operations stage. And just to kind of go through those in more detail, the first stage, the sensory motor stage, that's birth till 2 years old, where individuals gain an understanding of their world through their senses and motor activities. They coordinate sensory experiences such as seeing and hearing with the physical motor actions. Then the next stage, which is the pre-operational stage, that lasts from approximately 2 to 7 years of age. And that's the second stage, where children go beyond simply connecting sensory information with physical action and represent the world with words, images, and drawings. However, according to Piaget, preschool children still lack the ability to perform what he calls operations, which are internalized mental actions that allow children to do mentally what they previously could only do physically. So, for example, if you imagine putting two sticks together to see whether they would be as long as another stick without actually moving the sticks, you're performing a concrete operation. Also, children in this stage are engaging in pretend play. They exhibit egocentric thinking, and what egocentric thinking means is they're basically seeing things from their own point of view. It's hard for children in this stage to kind of see or kind of envision what another person is thinking or see something from another person's point of view. So, they're basically in their own world at this age. That's why a lot of times it's hard for children in this age to kind of maybe share their toys with other people and things like that. The next stage, stage 3, concrete operational, that's 7 to approximately 11 or 12 years old. This is the third stage, where children can perform operations that involve objects, and they can reason logically when the reasoning can be applied to specific or concrete examples. For instance, concrete operational thinkers cannot imagine the steps necessary to complete an algebraic equation, which is too abstract for thinking at this stage of development. Children can order objects in a series. They can classify objects according to multiple dimensions and things like that. At the fourth stage, this is the formal operational stage, and that appears between the ages of 11 and 15 and continues throughout adulthood. In this stage, individuals move beyond concrete experiences and think in abstract and more logical terms. As part of thinking more abstractly, adolescents develop images of ideal circumstances. They might think about what an ideal parent is like and compare their parents to this ideal standard. They begin to entertain possibilities for the future, and they're fascinated with what they can be. In solving problems, they may be more systematic, developing hypotheses about why something is happening the way it is, and then testing these hypotheses. So children at this age are becoming more interested in the world of ideas. So this is basically an overview of the stages. Piaget's stages of cognitive development, and this is found in your book. This little chart here that kind of gives you an overview of all the stages. So Vygotsky is one of the next theories that we're going to talk about, and he came up with the socio-cultural cognitive theory. He's like Piaget in a lot of ways, in the sense that he says that children actively construct their own knowledge. And he was a Russian theorist, born in 1896 and died in 1934. Vygotsky gave social interaction and culture far more important roles in cognitive development than Piaget did. His theory of sociocultural cognitive, um, his theory is a sociocultural cognitive theory that emphasizes how culture and social interaction guide cognitive development. Um, so he says that basically learning is based upon inventions of society. So children's social interaction with highly skilled adults or highly skilled peers is crucial to their cognitive development. So basically, what he says is that if children interact with children at a more higher level than they will kind of reach that higher level and get to that'll contribute to their learning. The information processing theory is another cognitive theory, and that emphasizes that individuals manipulate information. They monitor it and they strategize about it. Unlike Piaget's theory, but like Vygotsky's theory, the information processing theory does not describe development as stage-like as it does, as Piaget does and as Erikson does. They have their stages, but for information processing theory, it's not like that. Instead, in this theory, individuals develop a gradually increasing capacity for processing information, and that allows them to acquire increasingly complex knowledge and skills. And a leading expert in this theory, one leading expert in this theory is Robert Siegler. And he thinks that thinking is information processing. So in other words, when individuals perceive, encode, represent, store, and retrieve information, they are actually thinking. And Siegler also emphasizes that an important aspect of development is learning good strategies for processing information. For example, becoming a better reader might involve learning to monitor the key themes of the material being read. So another thing to remember about this theory is that individuals develop a gradually increasing capacity for processing information. Moving on to some of the other theories, we have behavioral and social cognitive theories. We have Skinner's operant conditioning. Through operant conditioning, the consequences of a behavior produce changes in the probability of the behavior's occurrence. So, a behavior followed by a rewarding stimulus is more likely to reoccur. Whereas a behavior followed by a punishing stimulus is less likely to occur. So if you have a child who you'd like to take their behavior and improve and have them continue doing that behavior over and over again. So for example, a child cleans up his or her room without being asked. After a child does that, a consequence of that would be to reward the child, and that can be through saying something like, oh, you did a good job, or maybe smiling at them, or maybe giving them their favorite dessert after dinner. That would be rewarding the stimulus, and that would make their behavior more likely to occur again. So that would make it more likely for the child to clean their room the next day and the next day after that. So on the opposite side, the flip side of that would be if you would want to make a certain behavior less likely to occur, you would punish a behavior. So if a child is running all crazy around their room, making a really big mess, maybe writing on the walls, you, as a parent, the parent might give a disapproving look to the child when they do that, or say, say something like, "You're not supposed to do that." Maybe frown when the child does that, and that would make the behavior less likely to occur again, because the child is not getting a positive reinforcement from that behavior. And it's important that this does happen early, in the early years of development, because if you have a child that's learned to consistently write on the walls and not get any kind of punishment or any kind of a consequence for that happening, they're going to learn that that's an okay behavior to do again and again and again. And by the time the child is older, it's going to be more difficult for a parent to come back and start practicing the punishment when they never did that before. It's going to be hard for a child to change their behavior after they've known that behavior for so long. So this is kind of how this shows kind of how reinforcement strengthens and increases behaviors, how and also how positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, they both can strengthen behaviors. So you have primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. The primary reinforcers are basically meet an unlearned biological need. And that can be anything from like food, warmth, shelter, things like that. Secondary reinforcers meet a learned, not biological need. So things like money, things that we're not born automatically needing. Like it's not a physical need. So some of the positive reinforcements that can strengthen a behavior, an example of that would be you hug your baby and he smiles at you. In addition, the addition of this smile strengthens the likelihood that you will hug him again. So the baby is actually giving you a positive, or giving the parent or adult the positive reinforcement, and that increases the likelihood that the parent will hug the child again. Or if you do a favor for a friend and she buys you lunch in return. That would be considered a primary reinforcer, because lunch is a biological need. We need to eat. An example of secondary reinforcer that's a positive reinforcement would be you increase profits and receive $200 as a bonus. So the money is the secondary reinforcer. Or you study hard and receive a good grade on your psychology exam. So grades that you receive in classes are considered secondary reinforcers, because they're not a biological need. There's something that's learned after after going to school and things like that. Some examples of negative reinforcement include things like your baby is crying, so you hug him and he stops crying. So the removal of the crying strengthens the likelihood that you'll hug him again when he cries. Or you take an aspirin for your headache, which takes the pain away. So that's considered primary reinforcer. That's also considered a negative reinforcement. Another example of a secondary reinforcer is after a high sales, your boss says you won't have to work on weekends, or you're allowed to skip the final exam because you did so well on your unit exams. So moving on to some of the other theories, we have behavioral and social cognitive theories. Bandura's social cognitive theory. This is where behaviors basically, behavior, environment, and cognition are key factors in development. Some psychologists agree with the behaviorist notion that development is learned and uninfluenced strongly by environment environmental interactions. However, unlike Skinner, they also see cognition as important in understanding development. So the social cognitive theory basically states that cognitive processes have important links with the environment and with behavior. So observational learning is basically learning through observation, and this is part of the social cognitive theory. And it's basically exactly how it sounds. Someone observes someone doing something, and that's how they learn. So it's basically learning through imitating or modeling other people's behaviors. For example, a boy observing his father yelling in anger and treating people with hostility. With his peers, the boy is later going to act very aggressively, showing the same characteristics as his father's behavior. And that's kind of this. Bandura did an experiment where children were placed in front of a television, in front of a video, and the video showed other children acting extremely aggressive towards this fake doll, like a fake clown. It's considered the Bobo doll experiment, and basically they showed children, acting very aggressively, hitting the Bobo doll, pointing a gun at the Bobo doll, pretending to shoot the Bobo doll. And then afterwards, those children that were viewing that video of the other children doing that were placed in the same room that they saw those other children, and the Bobo doll was there. They had toys there. They had all kinds of things. And what they found was that the children would imitate the same behaviors that they saw on the video, viewing the other children, beating up the doll and everything. So the children that viewed that behavior did the same exact thing. They went into the room, they started beating up the Bobo doll, they started hitting him, they started pointing the gun at him. And basically, this is where the notion of observational learning came about, and that's learning through observation. So this is kind of an overview and comparison of all the different theories. We have the psychoanalytic theory, where we talked about Freud and Erikson. They are both considered psychoanalysis. Freud's biological determination interacting with early family experiences, and Erikson's more of a balanced biological cultural interaction perspective. We have the cognitive theory, where we spoke about Piaget and the information processing view, and the behavioral and social cognitive theory, and that's basically environment is viewed as the cause of behavior in both of the views of behavioral and social. Then we have ethological and ecological. And these, ethological has a strong biological view, and that's basically, it holds that basically that development reflects the influence of several environmental systems. So basically this theory identifies that there's 5 different environmental systems, and that includes the microsystem. The microsystem is the setting in which the individual lives, the setting wherever, that it can include families, person's family, peers, friends, school, the neighborhood. And it's in the microsystem that the most direct interactions with social agents take place. With parents, teachers, peers, for example. The individual is not a passive recipient of experiences in these settings, but someone who helps to construct these settings. In the mesosystem, that's another setting. another system that the theory identifies with, and that involves relations between the microsystem or connections between contexts. And examples of that are the relation between, family experiences to school experiences, or from school experiences to religious experiences, and like things like family experiences to peer experiences. Then we have the exosystem, and that consists of links between a social setting in which the individual does not have an active role, and the individual's immediate context. So, for examples of that would be a husband or child's experience at home may be influenced by a mother's experience at work, or the mother might receive a promotion that requires more travel, which might increase conflict with the husband and change patterns of interaction with the child. Then we have the macro system, and that involves the culture in which individuals live. Then we have the chrono system, and that consists of the patterning of environmental events and transitions over the life course. For example, divorce could be one transition. Researchers have found that negative effects of divorce on children often peak in the first year after the divorce. So that's the ethological view for this class. We're not going to go into very much detail on that theory as far as exams and things like that. For the ecological view, basically, the contributions of the theory include a systematic examination of the macro and the micro dimensions of environmental systems and attention to connections between environmental systems. And we're not going to really go through much detail on that theory either. So although theories are helpful guides, I want you just to keep in mind that relying on any one single theory of development is probably not a good idea. And the book that we use for this course usually kind of takes an eclectic theoretical approach to the different theories. So the book, the things that we talk about in this course might pick and choose different aspects of different theories and kind of combine those together to explain the different aspects of development in an individual. So basically that was an overview of chapter 1, and the next chapter would be chapter 2, and that is going to go through the beginnings. The beginnings of development.